During World War II, Nazi Germany revealed its most important secrets in a way few could have imagined. It did not happen amid falling bombs or direct confrontations, but in ordinary moments, private conversations, careless remarks exchanged by those who believed they were safe, and inside rooms designed to feel absolutely quiet. As pressure faded and vigilance slowly relaxed, people began to speak more than necessary, not to betray, but to share, to unburden themselves, and to affirm their own sense of worth. From these seemingly harmless words, the full structure of Germany's war machine gradually came into view. In the summer of 1942, as the war escalated across every front, the United States quietly undertook an operation that did not appear on any battlefield map. Along the banks of the Potomac River in Virginia, an old facility was transformed in silence, without a nameplate, without flags, without any sign that it was about to become one of the most consequential battlegrounds of the war. On paper, it carried only a meaningless label, P.O. Box 1142, a postal address used to conceal the true identity of Fort Hunt, a top-secret detention and interrogation center run by U.S. intelligence. From 1942 to 1945, more than 4,000 German prisoners passed through its gates. They were not anonymous enlisted men, but some of the most valuable minds of Nazi Germany. Senior officers, seasoned intelligence operatives, military engineers, and leading scientists. Among them were Wernher von Braun, the architect of the V-2 rocket program, Reinhard Gehlen, head of Germany's military intelligence network on the Eastern Front, and Heinz Schlicke, a pioneer in infrared technology. Every one of them was brought here for a single purpose, not to be punished, but to be listened to. Fort Hunt bore little resemblance to the prisoner of war camps familiar from popular films. There were no beatings, no intimidation, no harsh interrogation rooms. Instead, the site operated like a carefully constructed detention club, designed specifically for psychological warfare. From the very beginning, the entire compound was saturated with a dense network of hidden microphones, so extensive that even those who installed them struggled to remember every location. Cells, common rooms, hallways, lawns, even the trees outside had ears. At Fort Hunt, there was no place that was truly silent, a former staff member said. After the war, every sound was routed to a hidden control room, where German-speaking specialists worked around the clock, never asking a single question, only recording, analyzing, and stitching together scattered fragments of information. Interrogation was unnecessary here, because the Americans understood one essential truth. The most important things are never said when someone is being questioned, but only emerge when a person believes they are speaking in private. To create that sense of safety, Fort Hunt was transformed into a place that was comfortable to a dangerous degree. Compared to other detention facilities, it was almost a paradise. German prisoners were well fed, properly clothed, and given access to softball fields, swimming pools, evening movie screenings, American cigarettes, and beer and liquor without restriction. At times, they were even taken on walks or shopping trips in Washington, D.C., like reluctant tourists, always accompanied, yet never made to feel controlled. This courtesy was not simple humanitarianism. It was strategy. Gradually, these privileged guests lowered their guard, felt respected, sometimes even grateful, and it was in that state that they began to speak more freely than they ever should have. The operation went even further. Fort Hunt added another, more subtle layer to the trap. Some of the prisoners were not prisoners at all. Certain individuals placed in shared rooms with high-value detainees were in fact undercover operatives, carefully trained in the exact subjects their targets cared about, from nuclear physics to military unit organization. They did not interrogate or press for answers. And when German prisoners believed they were speaking with comrades, they relaxed, displayed their knowledge, complained, argued, and willingly revealed things they would never have admitted in a formal interrogation room. As one interrogation officer later summarized, "If you want to hear the truth, do not question the enemy. Let them talk to each other." Of course, not everyone fell into the trap. Some sharp-minded prisoners grew suspicious early and tested their surroundings. One jumped hard on his bed to see if anything would react. Another deliberately put on a performance, inventing nonsense stories to mock the listeners he believed were hiding nearby. But these men were a minority. Most were convinced that the Americans did not truly understand them, that the comfort they were given reflected an opponent who was naive or who had underestimated them. That confidence proved to be the fatal mistake. For the most uncooperative cases, Fort Hunt was prepared to shift toward harsher psychological pressure. Fear of the Soviet Union became a cold and effective lever. A mere suggestion that a prisoner might be handed over to the Red Army, with Siberia waiting on the other end, was often enough to produce an immediate change in attitude. In some cases, the pressure went further. Wernher, a notorious U-boat commander, was threatened with extradition to Britain to stand trial for war crimes. Realizing that the path ahead led only to the gallows, Henke panicked, attempted to escape, and was shot dead, becoming the only prisoner to lose his life at Fort Hunt. The incident served as a reminder that behind its calm exterior, this place remained a battlefield, and when necessary, the Americans were willing to act. After the war, P.O. Box 1142 all but vanished from official history. Files were destroyed, recordings erased, and the compound returned to its original quiet. Only decades later, as documents were gradually declassified, did it become clear that within those rooms without gunfire, the course of the war had shifted more than once. Even former American intelligence officers were surprised by the weight of what they had accomplished in silence. And the central question remained. From those thousands of hours of listening, what secrets had the Americans uncovered? Secrets powerful enough to slow Hitler's weapons, fracture Germany's strategy, and push the war closer to its end? What unfolded at Fort Hunt never resembled intelligence gathering in the traditional sense. There was no dramatic breakthrough, no shocking revelation that suddenly exposed the enemy. Only thousands of hours of recorded silence, thousands of conversations that seemed trivial at first glance, and a team of analysts patiently fitting together the smallest details. Yet it was through this process that the Americans gradually realized they were doing more than listening in on prisoners. They were seeing the entire structure of Germany's war machine laid bare, from ambition and technology to the fatigue and internal fractures spreading beneath the surface. The first crucial clue emerged in a way no one expected. It did not come from a classified document or from testimony forced under pressure, but from a single name mentioned during a private conversation: Peenemünde. To German officers, it was simply a familiar place, a workplace, one component of the war effort they believed remained safely concealed. To American intelligence, however, the name immediately raised a serious question. Subsequent intercepted conversations added fragments of context. A new weapon, unprecedented range, destructive power, capable of altering the course of the war. No one needed to explain the whole picture. It was enough that many people spoke similar fragments. From that point on, Peenemünde was identified not as an ordinary base, but as the center of Nazi Germany's missile development program. The air raid of August 1943 did more than damage V-2 research facilities. It shattered a dangerous illusion in Berlin, the belief that superweapons could be developed in perfect secrecy. In the months that followed, Fort Hunt continued to produce fragments of information related to V-1 and V-2, production tempo, technical obstacles, and unfinished projects. The Americans did not need to know everything. They needed only to know enough to understand that time was the decisive factor, and that each precise strike could slow an entire weapons program. In parallel with developments on the ground, the skies over Europe began to reveal troubling signs. At Fort Hunt and Trent Park, German Air Force officers debated radar, navigation equipment, and the methods they had once used to penetrate enemy air defense networks. To them, these were professional discussions, technical comparisons exchanged among specialists. To American and British intelligence, however, they became the key to understanding how Germany's defensive systems actually functioned. Each small detail helped the Allies adjust tactics, disrupt radar coverage, and gradually close gaps they had not previously recognized. By 1944, a clear shift appeared in these conversations. German aircraft were faster, harder to pursue, and no longer seemed bound by familiar limits. When a prisoner casually boasted that their engines no longer relied on propellers but were powered by jet thrust, the Americans immediately understood that a technological threshold had been crossed. Nazi Germany was entering a new era. And if the Allies failed to accelerate their own efforts, air superiority could be reversed. This insight did not come from a laboratory report, but from the complacency of men who believed jet propulsion remained beyond the reach of their enemies. Beneath the surface of the sea, the picture was even darker. U-boat commanders, speaking among themselves, complained about patrols that grew more dangerous by the day, about the constant sense of being hunted, about losses that could no longer be concealed. They spoke of new torpedoes and technical improvements they believed would change the course of the war in the Atlantic. Yet these very accounts allowed American and British intelligence to gain a clearer understanding of how German submarines operated, from attack doctrine to structural vulnerabilities. Once information about magnetic and acoustic torpedoes was pieced together, the U.S. Navy was able to adjust defensive measures in time, reducing losses during the decisive phase of the naval war. The culmination of this stream of intelligence came in the final days of the war in Europe, when the submarine U-234 surrendered. From the crew's testimony at Fort Hunt, the Americans learned that the vessel carried more than ordinary cargo. On board were an unassembled jet aircraft and more than half a ton of uranium oxide, bound for Japan. This was not merely a shipment. It was evidence that Germany and Japan were still attempting to revive their war efforts at any cost. By intercepting U-234, the Allies cut off a dangerous possibility just before it could become reality. Deeper still lay the story of Nazi Germany's nuclear ambitions. At Fort Hunt, several scientific prisoners spoke of uranium refinement, as if it were merely a routine part of research life. At the time, many American intelligence officers did not fully grasp the significance of these remarks. They recorded them, categorized them, and forwarded the reports up the chain of command, treating them as they did countless other pieces of information. Only when the world witnessed Hiroshima did many realize that those scattered fragments had helped the Allies gauge how far Germany's nuclear program had progressed, and to understand that this war could not be allowed to drag on any longer. Although historians continue to debate the extent of the direct impact, it is difficult to deny that awareness of Germany's scientific capabilities influenced strategic decisions aimed at bringing the war to an end. Yet Fort Hunt and Trent Park revealed more than weapons programs. They exposed the state of mind of the men behind those weapons. In intercepted conversations, German generals spoke of an army drained by years of fighting, of orders from Berlin that grew increasingly detached from reality, and of Hitler's blind faith in so-called miracle weapons. For the first time, American and British listeners heard doubt emerging from within the Nazi command structure itself. From that moment, they understood that the enemy was no longer a unified force, but a system beginning to fracture. This insight became the foundation for psychological warfare campaigns, for messages urging surrender, and for a way of waging war that relied not only on bombs and firepower, but on exploiting the enemy's loss of confidence and growing despair. An unexpected consequence, one with profound historical significance, also emerged from those walls that had ears. Believing that no one was listening, some German officers spoke openly about massacres they had witnessed or taken part in, their tone as cold and routine as if describing everyday work. For those seated in the listening rooms, this was the moment they understood that the war was not merely a struggle for territory or power, but a confrontation with a machinery of brutality. These words later became evidence in the Nuremberg trials, and reinforced the Allies' resolve that the war could end only with the complete collapse of the Nazi regime. None of this was seized through violence. It was spoken into silence. And within that silence, American and British intelligence heard enough to act before it was too late. As historian Helen Fry has observed, had these secrets not been exposed in time at Fort Hunt, Trent Park, and similar facilities, Nazi Germany might have been able to prolong the war, perhaps even alter its course through its advanced weapons programs. Fortunately for the world, that silent war ended sooner, because there were people patient enough to listen while the enemy believed no one was listening, while the Americans quietly operated P.O. Box 1142 across the Atlantic. Another intelligence front was taking shape in Britain, no less sophisticated and in some ways even more daring in its psychological design. The British did not build a prison in the conventional sense. They chose a very different path, turning luxury itself into a disguise for extracting secrets. On the outskirts of London, amid tree-lined roads and the calm atmosphere of the upper class, the Trent Park estate was selected as the center of this operation. It was a place once owned by the aristocracy, refined enough to mislead, isolated enough to ensure total control, and discreet enough for everything to unfold without attracting attention. From late 1939, when the war was still taking shape, My 19 transformed Trent Park into a special detention site reserved exclusively for Nazi Germany's generals and senior officers. These were not easy men to exploit. They were accustomed to giving orders, to being respected, to living within a rigid code of military ritual and honor. British intelligence understood that force would produce only a hollow silence. What they needed was a different kind of quiet, one that encouraged the other side to speak on its own. Trent Park was designed precisely with that purpose in mind. The officer placed in direct charge of the operation was Colonel Thomas Kendrick, a seasoned counterintelligence specialist. Under his direction, the entire estate was turned into a complete listening system, concealed so carefully that even those living inside it never sensed its presence. Kilometers of wiring were embedded within the old structure of the building, threaded through wooden walls, ceilings, fireplaces, and living room floors. Microphones were hidden in objects so familiar that no one questioned them. Chandeliers, wall panels, table legs, flower pots, even the hedges where German generals often stood to smoke and talk. Every signal was routed to a secret recording room in the basement, where listeners worked in darkness, capturing every word spoken above them. The system was tested with extreme rigor. Mi-19 engineers ensured there were no stray sounds, no technical clues, no unusual reactions that might arouse suspicion. In fact, throughout the entire war, not one of the 59 German generals held at Trent Park ever realized that every conversation was being continuously recorded. They believed it was simply a high-level detention facility, a place where defeated officers were treated according to the code of gentlemanly conduct they still trusted. The strategy behind Trent Park rested on a single, consistent principle: create a sense of safety, long enough for vigilance to dissolve on its own. German generals were allowed to wear civilian clothes or neatly pressed uniforms, addressed by their ranks, and greeted by British guards with proper military courtesy. Meals were carefully prepared, with beer and wine served regularly. In the evenings, they played billiards, chess, listened to classical music, or walked through the expansive gardens. More like guests at a resort than prisoners in detention. At times, British officers even escorted them into central London for lunch at elegant restaurants, something without precedent in the history of prisoner-of-war treatment. For men such as Wilhelm von Thoma, Heinrich Eberbach, or Dietrich von Kultitz, the initial reaction was caution. They understood war, and they understood that such courtesy could not be entirely without purpose. Yet as days passed without interrogation, without questioning, without pressure, suspicion gradually gave way to relief. Being captured was humiliation enough. At least here, their dignity remained intact. And it was precisely when that psychological armor lowered that the nature of their conversations began to change. At first, They spoke of personal matters, family life, and Germany before the war. Gradually, the focus shifted to military affairs and the state of the conflict. They discussed the collapse of the Italian front, speculated about Rommel's whereabouts, and debated where the Allies might land in France. No one presented information as a formal report. Each man contributed only fragments, impressions, rumors. Yet, when those fragments were placed side by side, a strategic picture began to take shape. All of it unfolded within an atmosphere the German generals believed was shared only among comrades. Mi-19 did not remain a passive observer. Working in the shadows, they actively guided the rhythm of conversation. Some records suggest that the British placed undercover operatives posing as captured German officers among the generals, subtly steering discussions in directions useful to intelligence. Even so, most of the information came from a simpler source. People speak most freely when they feel respected and unthreatened. Every morning, coffee in the garden. Every afternoon walk. Every evening debate around the billiards table became an opportunity. Inside the recording room, known as the M room, the team of secret listeners worked without pause. Most were German Jews who had fled their homeland in the 1,930 seconds, carrying with them a deep understanding of the language, culture, and mindset of Germany's officer class. They did more than hear words. They caught nuance, tone, and half-joking remarks. Each conversation was recorded, analyzed, and compared against thousands of others. Over the course of the war, roughly 8,000 conversations at Trent Park were captured and processed, forming a rare and invaluable intelligence archive. The greatest value of Trent Park did not lie in uncovering a single secret, but in its power to anticipate. Early in 1943, intercepted conversations led British intelligence to suspect that Germany was preparing to deploy a new kind of weapon, one capable of flight without a pilot. No one stated it outright, yet the pieces gradually fit together. Churchill was briefed and investigations were expanded. When the first V-1 flying bombs screamed over London in June 1944, Britain was not taken by surprise. Air defenses had been prepared, and interceptor aircraft were ready. Trent Park did not stop the V-1, but it stripped away the weapon's most critical advantage: surprise. The same pattern emerged with the V-2 program. Before these uncatchable rockets began falling on London, British intelligence already knew enough to warn the Allies to focus their efforts on destroying German launch sites and logistical infrastructure. At the same time, conversations at Trent Park revealed another dimension, one no less dangerous: fractures within the Nazi command structure. Generals complained about the party's increasingly irrational interference, about reports distorted to please Hitler, and about blind faith placed in so-called miracle weapons. The British were not only hearing military plans, they were hearing despair spreading through the ranks. From this intelligence, psychological warfare followed. When Mi-19 identified a German general who was deeply disillusioned and believed the war was lost, they did not interrogate him. Instead, they allowed him to accidentally encounter a newspaper claiming that other German generals were seeking negotiations with the Allies. That evening, in his room, he began discussing with colleagues whether the German army should look for a way to end the war with honor. The conversation was recorded and sent directly to Churchill. The idea never became reality, but it gave the Allies a clearer understanding of how to strike at the enemy's mindset. Trent Park was never meant to force the Germans to talk. It was designed to let them speak on their own. And for that very reason, Germany's most important information about weapons, strategy, and morale was revealed not under interrogation lights, but inside warm rooms, among men who believed they were safe. Silence here did not mean the absence of sound. It was the perfect shell that allowed secrets to slip out on their own. What happened at Fort Hunt, Trent Park, and similar facilities was never celebrated in victory headlines or post-war parades. These operations produced no heroic battlefield images, and no explosive moments etched into collective memory. Yet it was precisely these quiet intelligence achievements that shaped Allied victory in a deeper and more enduring way than any single battle. In doing so, the Americans and the British demonstrated a truth that seems almost paradoxical in total war. At critical moments, decisive power does not lie in firepower, but in the ability to listen at the right time. Fort Hunt and Trent Park revealed a lesson that military academies would take decades to formalize into doctrine. Intelligence does not come only from broken codes or daring agents behind enemy lines. It also emerges from the enemy itself when it believes it is safe. When pressure is removed, when honor remains intact, when fear is replaced by a sense of respect, people begin to talk. And in war, what is spoken at the wrong moment can matter more than what is deliberately withheld. The Allies did not compel prisoners to confess. They created conditions in which secrets slipped from the enemy's mouth on their own, piece by piece, until a complete picture took shape. These listening operations did more than deliver immediate tactical advantages. They created a lasting strategic edge, allowing the Allies to stay one step ahead in both technological and psychological competition. Information about the V-1, V-2, radar systems, and U-boats was not merely technical data. It revealed how Nazi Germany thought, the faith it placed in so-called decisive weapons, and the growing gap between ambition and reality. As a result, British and American intelligence learned not only what their enemy was doing, but also what it hoped for, what it feared, and where it was going wrong. Historian Helen Fry has described this as one of the greatest intelligence operations of World War II, not because of the volume of secrets obtained, but because of the method used to extract them. These secrets were not forced out or taken through violence. They were gathered through patience, discipline, and a deep understanding of human psychology. Detention rooms became recording rooms. Walls became listeners. And men who had once been enemies turned into the most valuable sources of information, even though they never intended to betray anything. The consequences of this approach did not end in 1945. When the war concluded, the world entered a new era in which information became a strategic asset equal in importance to nuclear weapons. Many individuals who had once been detained and quietly listened to later became part of a new global order. Reinhard Gehlen is a prime example. Instead of being tried like many other generals, he was protected and employed by the United States to help build an intelligence network against the Soviet Union, laying the foundation for West Germany's intelligence service during the Cold War. That decision cannot be separated from what American intelligence already knew about him, including information gathered when he believed he was speaking within a safe and private setting. Similarly, Wernher von Braun and his rocket science team carried more than technical knowledge with them to the United States. They also brought a profound lesson about how modern wars are decided. Their recruitment, rather than punishment, reflected a philosophy forged at Fort Hunt and Trent Park: understand the enemy before eliminating them. From wartime listening rooms, a path opened toward the space program and the race to the moon, revealing the long-term consequences of winning through intelligence rather than strength alone. This story also highlights a stark moral contrast in the conduct of war. While Nazi Germany relied on torture, terror, and systematic destruction to control people, the Americans and the British demonstrated that a different approach could yield superior results. They did not need to degrade their opponents to defeat them. By allowing prisoners to retain a sense of their own humanity, they created conditions in which the enemy spoke freely, revealing truths that would never have emerged under violence. Many German prisoners later admitted their respect for this treatment, even though they never realized that every personal confession had been recorded. The letter of thanks written by Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt to a British officer at Trent Park stands as a clear example of this paradox. He wrote with the sincerity of a man who believed he had been treated fairly and humanely. Although he never understood that he had spent that entire period inside a perfectly constructed listening cage, the letter nonetheless reflects the power of the approach the Allies chose. Victory achieved without stripping the defeated of their humanity. More than 7 decades later, the recordings from Fort Hunt and Trent Park have gradually been declassified, allowing history to revisit a front that had remained almost entirely hidden. Museums in Britain and the United States have begun to reconstruct these spaces, recreating the M-Room listening chamber, displaying crude yet effective recording equipment, and inviting visitors to wear headphones to experience what the secret listeners once heard. The purpose is not to glorify cleverness, but to remind us that war is shaped not only by what explodes on the battlefield, but also by what is spoken when people believe no one is listening. From the sealed rooms at Fort Hunt to the quiet estate at Trent Park, a silent legacy took shape, one that extended far beyond the scope of World War II. What happened there shows that in history's decisive moments, power does not always need to make a sound. Silence, when carefully organized and controlled, can become the sharpest weapon of all. Not the silence of fear or submission, but a deliberate stillness, deep enough to prompt the other side to speak its most important truths. And within that calculated quiet, the Allies found the key to bringing the most devastating war in human history to an end.